Hey everybody, Hoosier Jedi here with another review for you. This time talking episode 7 of season 1 of Star Trek Discovery, Magic to Make the Sanest Man Go Mad. And I think this was a pretty solid episode. It just seems a bit odd that we go from having Cornwell being captured by the Klingons, which, big deal, to this episode, which, while fun, doesn't really have that much to do with the rest of the bigger plot. And it does seem a bit odd that they completely leave this incredibly important plot development with Cornwell just hanging out there. But I suppose maybe they decided it was time for a little bit of fun before they kind of push into what is doubtlessly going to be the more serious episodes as we move towards things getting wrapped up. So let's kind of get right into things. First of all, I find it intensely amusing just that apparently like Wyclef Jean songs have lasted so far into the future. I mean, I'm not saying that in a negative way. It just sort of seems so much like the whole thing with like the J.J. Abrams movie, Star Trek movie with the Beastie Boys. And don't get me wrong, I like Sabotage. It's a great song. Wyclef Jean has also put out some stuff that I thought was quite good. I'm not super. I don't think I've heard this song that they used here before, but it's still a pretty good song. But it does sort of have the question of, well, why are people so far into the future listening to music from our time? Surely people in that time are making music as well. It just sort of seems that kind of strange that. Well, how often do you listen to music from like a couple hundred years ago? Well, unless you're really into classical music, probably not. Then again, pop music, as we tend to define it, is a fairly recent thing. And it's not inconceivable that certain songs could simply just become ingrained as classics or under certain circumstances. So, or just sort of like, this is a traditional, party song or something like that that people have listened to for centuries. And it is kind of interesting to think that that is not impossible with some of the stuff that we're listening to today. It certainly be interesting to find out. Well, okay, we won't find out because we'll all be dead. What 300 years in the future, what music from our time people might remember. I have a feeling there might be some interesting choices. You never really know what's going to stand the test of time. Anyway, this is I mean, we've seen stories like this before on Star Trek, but well, Star Trek has never been shy about cribbing from itself, so I can't really fault the series for that. And stories like this are often quite fun. I mean, the whole various different ways Mud kills Captain Lorca are used for comedy. Never mind the fact that, we see Harry murder literally hundreds of people multiple times over. And him even saying, like, yeah, this is like the 53rd time I've done this. Which, sorry, I've been playing Danganronpa, the Danganronpa video game series recently, and the number 53 is kind of an important one in one of those games, so I'm just intensely amused by that. But I'm not going to say anything further, except that if you've never played the Danganronpa games, do give them a try. They're really, really cool. Anyway, this episode, Mud is here kind of to sort of bring him back. I mean, yeah, he is kind of a character that people have been fond of for quite a long time. And when we first saw him last time around, he seemed a very far cry from the sort of irritating, but not sort of the irritating character that we met in Next Gen, although irritating yet extremely crafty. Here, things do I'm sorry, did I say Next Gen? I meant the original series. Here, it sort of brings him into a little bit more closer line with what we saw in the original series. Stella is a character who is pretty important there. And we see that, one of Harry's big things in the original series is that being married to Stella was an absolute misery for him. And here we get to see how all of that comes about. And I do really love that Burnham and Ash are ultimately able to stop Harry by using just non-trivial systems, I mean, non-vital systems in the ship, and simply playing to his ego. You know, they do. I mean, they make it quite clear. Yes, you can con the con man, and I always love stories like that. You know, where so you have somebody who's very good at manipulation. They go up against somebody who's, you know, maybe that's not their strongest suit, but the non-con man learns very quickly how to play the game, and it almost always involves playing to the other person's ego, because that almost always works. I mean, there's a reason why in The Devil's Advocate the devil says vanity is his favorite sin. And the relationship between Burnham and Ash is pretty good this episode. We really do kind of get to see them establishing this sort of interesting dynamic, and the whole multiple timelines thing does allow us to sort of see various facets of this aspect of this relationship that do shed various lights on how they connect with each other. It's really well done. And I definitely did like Drunk Tilly this episode. It really, I think, does a nice job of fleshing her out as a character. I mean, it was some really nice moments for Tilly this episode. Um, Also, nice moments for Ash, like when he takes a minute to sort of say, like, hey, let's not forget all the people that died fighting this war. They point to some guy in a wheelchair and sort of like, hey, let's not forget all the people who've been hurt and maimed and all of this, who are never going to be 100% the same, but are still out there fighting. I mean, we've got a helmsman up on there from the Shinzo, who's now a cyborg because of this. So it's sort of nice to acknowledge that, yeah, even in Star Trek, there are limits to what their medical technology can do. I mean, as evidenced by Geordi. Um, a little surprising, and I know this might come across as a tad insensitive, a little surprising that, they can make starships, but they can't, help a guy walk again. But now that I think about it a little more, there have that that's not entirely unreasonable in Star Trek. So okay, maybe I'm analyzing that a little too much. Uh, but anyway, getting back into things. The whole the whole space whale thing, that was pretty funny. I mean, space whales. I mean, there's even a TV trope called that. Whenever because people have trotted that idea out more than once. I always think of the Akanti from the X-Men comics, because that's what they literally were, was basically just giant whales that flew around in space. I mean, yes, it's a science fiction cliche, but, well, Star Trek is a science fiction show. Why not? Grab some of the cliches and, tinker around with them a little bit. The Gormagander, or whatever the heck it's called. I mean, it's not super important to the plot, but it's nice to be able to go out there and sort of play around with it a little bit. And, so you're like, hey, here's this cool alien. And it is interesting that Starfleet basically has an Endangered Species Act that they are required to conform to. And watching Lorca's obvious irritation with basically having to haul an animal to the pound. Okay, that's actually probably not a terribly good way to look at it, but I'm sure that's probably how Lorca viewed it, was more than a little bit hilarious. As was that helmet that Harry Mudd came out of the thing wearing. I mean, it frankly reminded me of like Ant-Man, or probably more explicitly like the Ant Agonizer from Fallout 3, if you've ever played that game. I mean, it just looks absolutely ridiculous. And then, he starts killing people while wearing this ridiculous helmet, which just totally destroys what should be a serious moment. It would be like watching somebody in like a bunny costume, start shooting people with a machine gun. You just can't take something like that seriously. Let's see. What else? it is an interesting idea that it really hadn't crossed my mind before. That yeah, of course the Klingons would pay big money to get their hands on Burnham because she's basically killed this enormously important religious figure to them. That's not something that ever really had crossed my mind before. So I do like that the show kind of did that, and I had to say it's like, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. Also, oh, what was that? I wanted to. Oh yeah, right. Um, we also I want to take a minute to talk about Stamets here, and this episode also did a nice job of sort of fleshing him out a little bit, and we get to see a little bit more about how this augmentation has started to mess with his personality. I mean, I love that sort of situation where it seems like he is just like absolutely stoned out of his gourd, and the part where he kind of starts to form a more of a meaningful connection with Burnham and tells him the story about how he and his boyfriend met. That's all really nice. It's a way to sort of let us get to know this guy better. And Stamets is genuinely, I think, one of the more interesting characters to me on the show. I mean, he's not really here because he's a big military guy or he's a big Starfleet guy. He's sort of been reluctantly dragged into this and isn't too happy about seeing his life's work used for warfare. But under the circumstances, what other choice is there? So I think it's an interesting idea to sort of see somebody with that philosophy there. Somebody who's working with Starfleet, is a Starfleet officer, but is not a big fan of Starfleet. They're there by necessity, more necessity than choice. That they aren't enormous adherents to Starfleet's proclaimed philosophy, which I always think is interesting. Like the Star Trek, one of the reasons I like Star Trek is that it does present a future that is better, a world that is more ideal but not flawless, a world where people have become better, which I think science fiction desperately at times does need that more optimistic viewpoint because the dark sci-fi dystopia and all of that other stuff. I mean, that's just such an easy route. I think the more optimistic futures are, just by sheer numbers, seem to be the rarer and more difficult thing to come up with and have be rich and enjoyable and still be rife for good storytelling opportunities. But anyway, getting back to what I said, I always thought that the characters who were human but stepped away from the mainstream ideology, the ideology that was always embodied in the series by Starfleet, and were sort of, kind of more mercenary, people who were out for themselves, who did believe in things like money. Vash from Next Gen was probably the most well-known example. Although we did see others over time. I mean, look at Tom Paris. He started out in a Federation prison, although that was mostly because they just didn't want to take his character from Next Gen and use him again, because that means they would have had to pay additional money to the authors. But of that episode where Robert Duncan McNeil had previously appeared as a different character. Okay, we're just kind of going to let that go. Anyways, I think that covers everything that I had to say about this episode. Again, it's a nice episode, fun episode, but not really super relevant to the overall arcing plot of this season. But again, I think it's just sort of a situation where they're like, okay, let's pause for a moment, have some fun. We're getting towards the home stretch, and we're going to have to get pretty serious. Fun is going to be at a bit of a premium from now on. So let's have some laughs while we can, which, okay, fine, I can live with that. Anyway, guys, I'm going to call it here. As always, please comment, rate, and subscribe. Of course, you can follow me on Twitter at Hoosier Jedi, and also join me on Tumblr at Jedi Reviewer. Until next time, take care and have a good one.